There are two kinds of dead men in this world: the ones rotting in the ground, and the ones who are simply declared so. For 28 years, I've been the second kind. A ghost. A convenient fiction buried by my own son under a mountain of carefully constructed lies. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, my ghost got a phone call about an inheritance. The air in my workshop always smells the same: cedar, sawdust, and the sharp, clean scent of linseed oil. It's the smell of something real, something tangible being built from raw material. Light cut through the high windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust like a private galaxy. The only sound was the rhythmic shh of my grandfather's Stanley hand playing, smoothing a length of Oregon maple. It's a meditative sound, a sound that has kept the world at bay for nearly 3 decades. Then the other sound came. It was shrill, ugly, and utterly alien in this sanctuary of wood and steel. The black Bakelite landline on the wall, a relic I kept for reasons even I didn't fully understand, was ringing. No one ever called that number. Frank in New York had my cell. The lumber yard used the shop's main line. This line was a ghost itself, a dormant wire connecting me to a life I had methodically and deliberately erased. I set the plane down on its side, the blade gleaming. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron, feeling the familiar grit of sawdust under my nails. I walked over to the phone, letting it ring a 4th time, then a 5th, a test of my own patience. Finally, I lifted the heavy receiver. "Yeah," I said. My voice was rough from disuse. There was a pause, a carefully measured intake of breath on the other end. "Dad, is that you?" The voice was thicker now, coated in a smooth, confident veneer I didn't recognize. But underneath it, buried deep in the cadence, was the boy I remembered. The boy who could look you straight in the eye while lying through his teeth. 28 years dissolved in that single, hesitant question. I felt no surge of fatherly affection, no pang of loss. I felt the cold, curious detachment of a surgeon observing a fascinating, if malignant, tumor. "I'm listening, Kevin," I said. The name felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign word. Another pause. He was running a script in his head, and I just skipped a page. "Right. Wow. Okay. Look, I know this is unexpected. I don't even know what to say." "Then don't say anything. Get to the point." My tone was flat, the same tone I used when a contractor tried to explain why a job was 3 weeks behind schedule. He cleared his throat, the confidence returning, the salesman taking the stage. "It's about Aunt Eleanor. She passed away a few days ago, peaceful, in her sleep. I already knew. Eleanor and I had spoken 2 weeks prior. She sent me letters, cryptic postcards filled with notes about birds and paint colors that were really updates on the family she knew I watched from a distance. Her last one had simply said, 'The final canvas is stretched. It's going to be a masterpiece.' She was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who ever really saw me. I felt a brief, sharp jab of genuine loss, a cold pinprick in the numbness. I owed it to her to see this through. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and the lie was as smooth as the maple on my bench. "Yeah, well," he continued, eager to get to the transactional part of the conversation. "The thing is, she left a will. A rather significant one. Her estate is valued at about $8.2 million. He let the number hang in the air, a glittering prize meant to dazzle and disarm. I remained silent. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the background of his call. He was somewhere loud, somewhere busy, somewhere I wasn't. "She named you in the will, Dad, as a beneficiary, alongside me." He was speaking faster now. "There's just one small complication. A formality, really. The lawyers, you know how they are. They need all named beneficiaries present to execute the will. In person." I waited. I knew the punchline was coming. He finally said it, the words tumbling out in a rehearsed rush of feigned embarrassment. "So, this is incredibly awkward, but for the estate to be processed, we'll need you to be, well, legally not dead. Apparently, when you left, Mom had you officially declared deceased after 7 years. For tax reasons, she said. So, we have to sort of resurrect you. Legally speaking, I looked around my workshop, at the tools hanging in perfect order, at the neat stacks of cherry, oak, and maple, at the half-finished rocking chair I was making for a neighbor's first grandchild. A world of order, precision, and truth. And on the other end of the line was my son, the architect of my death, casually discussing my resurrection as a minor bureaucratic inconvenience standing between him and $8 million. And I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile my ex-wife used to fear. The kind of men in boardrooms learned to recognize as a precursor to their own professional demise. It was the quiet, calm smile that meant someone, somewhere, was about to learn a very, very expensive lesson. He mistook my silence for shock. Or maybe anger. He didn't know me at all. Dad, are you there? Look, I know it's a lot to ask, but it's what Eleanor wanted. I can fly you out to San Francisco. First class. Put you up. We can. I don't know talk. The offer to talk was the most insulting part of it all. He hadn't wanted to talk for 28 years. What he wanted was a signature. A ghost signature on a legal document. My smile widened. This wasn't just about money. It was about a story Kevin had written long ago, with himself as the abandoned hero and me as the villain who vanished. Now, I was being invited to write the final chapter, and I always finish what I start. Of course, son, I said, my voice suddenly warm, accommodating. The voice of a simple old carpenter from Oregon, a little bewildered by the ways of the big city. I'll come. It sounds like the right thing to do. For Eleanor. The relief on his end of the line was a palpable thing, a physical wave of it traveling through the phone. He'd gotten what he wanted. He thought the hard part was over. That's great, Dad. Really great, he said, his voice slick with victory. I'll have my assistant book the ticket. I'll text you the details. You do that, I said. We hung up. The silence of the workshop rushed back in, but it was different now. It was charged. The scent of cedar was no longer just the smell of wood. It was the smell of a box being built. A very precise, very strong, and perfectly inescapable box. I picked up my plane, held its familiar weight in my hands. He thought he was calling a retired woodworker. He'd forgotten who I was before I picked up these tools. He'd forgotten the man his mother called the surgeon. The man who didn't build things with his hands, but took them apart, piece by piece, until only the truth remained. I drew the plane across the maple. Shh. My son needed me to come back from the dead. I was more than happy to oblige. Preparation for this journey wasn't a matter of packing a bag. It was an exhumation. My quiet life in Astoria was a carefully constructed fortress, and to leave it, I had to unearth the man I had buried here 28 years ago. After locking the workshop, I went into my small, Spartan house. Everything in it was either made by my own hands or had served a purpose for at least a century. There was no clutter, no sentimentality, except for one thing. In the back of my closet, beneath a stack of wool blankets, sat an old steamer trunk. Brass fittings, dark leather straps. I hadn't opened it since the day I arrived. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a sigh of stale, trapped air. The scent of cedar and mothballs, the perfume of a sealed-off past. Inside, my former life lay in state, perfectly preserved. On top of a suit bag, not a flimsy plastic one, but heavy, breathable canvas. I unzipped it. The suit was charcoal gray worsted wool, tailored for me on Seville Road decades ago. It felt impossibly heavy in my hands, woven not just with thread, but with the weight of 1,000 boardroom battles, of billion-dollar deals signed and torpedoed. It was a uniform, armor. Beneath it, a leather watch roll. I opened it and picked up the Patek Philippe. The crystal was cold against my thumb. I wound it. The delicate, impossibly precise movement ticked to life, a tiny mechanical heart restarting after a long, long sleep. That watch hadn't just told time. It had measured deadlines, hostile takeovers, and the slow, agonizing dissolution of a family. I closed my eyes, and the memory I'd spent a lifetime sanding down returned with all its sharp edges intact. It wasn't one single event that broke us. It was a philosophy taught to Kevin by his mother, Diana. She hadn't married a man. She had married a trajectory. My rise through the ranks of corporate finance was, to her, the whole point of my existence. She saw my principles, my insistence on forensic honesty, on a man's word being his bond, as quaint, charming quirks in a bull market, but dangerous liabilities in the real world of shark she so desperately wanted to swim with. She taught our son that the appearance of success was more important than the foundation it was built on, a lesson he absorbed all too well. The end came when he was 17. I was orchestrating a complex, highly confidential merger, the kind of delicate surgery that had earned me the moniker the surgeon on the street. All my files were at home and my study locked. I was proud of Kevin. He was bright, charismatic, and I hoped, that my influence was a quiet counterweight to his mother's glitzy materialism. One evening, I came home to find him in my study. He'd picked the lock. The folder for the Acorn project was open on my desk. When I confronted him, he didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. He smiled that easy, charming smile of his. "Just curious," he said. "Wanted to see what the old man does all day." 2 days later, the deal imploded. A competitor made a preemptive bid, armed with information they could only have gotten from inside my team. It was a bloodbath. My firm lost millions. My reputation, my word, was questioned for the first time in my career. It took Frank Miller, my then protege, a week of quiet, off-the-books digging to find the leak. It wasn't a rival firm that had bought the information. It was the father of Kevin's new girlfriend, a real estate developer with a flashy lifestyle and a portfolio built on debt and bluster. He had paid Kevin $10,000, enough for a down payment on a used Porsche to impress the girl. When I laid the evidence on the dining room table, Diana defended him. "He's just a boy. He's ambitious. You should be proud he's learning how the world really works." But I only looked at my son. I didn't yell. I never yelled. "There are two things in this world that are foundational, Kevin," I said, my voice as quiet as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "Your word and your work. You just set fire to both. For a car. For a girl whose father has more boats than books." I gave him a choice. Not an ultimatum, a choice. "You will call Mr. Davies," I said, pointing to the phone. "You will tell him you are coming to his office tomorrow with me. You will return his money, and you will tell him exactly what you did and why it was wrong. You will own it, and then you will face the consequences. Or I'm gone." He looked at me. His eyes, so much like mine, were cold and calculating. He was weighing the options, the cost of admission versus the loss of face. He glanced at his mother, who gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head. He chose silence. So I left. I packed my watch, my suit, and a few other things in this trunk. I emptied my personal accounts, leaving Diana and Kevin with the house in Westchester, the portfolio, everything. I walked out and never looked back. I became a carpenter because I needed to spend the rest of my life building things that were real, things you could touch, measure, and rely on, things that couldn't lie. I opened my eyes. The workshop air, the scent of truth. The past was the past, but it was also the present. Kevin hadn't changed. He had just gotten older, the stakes higher. He was still the boy who would sell out his own father for a shiny new toy. This time, the toy was worth $8.2 million, and the father was already dead. What was there to lose? I went into the bathroom and turned on the hot water. The mirror showed me Art Callahan, the Astoria woodworker. Face weathered by Oregon coastal winds, silver hair a little too long, hands calloused and stained. A quiet man, a harmless man. I took out a straight razor, lathered my face with soap from a ceramic mug. The scrape of the blade was another familiar, precise sound. Stroke by stroke, the years fell away. The beard I'd worn for a decade disappeared. The rugged lines of my face sharpened into something more severe, more angular, more familiar. I trimmed my hair, combing it back ruthlessly from my forehead. Then I went back to the bedroom and put on the suit. The fabric fell perfectly. I remember my frame better than I did. I knotted a simple, dark silk tie, slipped the Patek onto my wrist, polished my old leather Oxfords until they shone like black glass. I looked in the mirror again. The man staring back was not a carpenter. His eyes were not the eyes of someone who found peace in the grain of a piece of wood. They were the eyes of a man who saw the world as a balanced sheet. A man who could spot a lie from 100 paces. A man who understood that true power wasn't about what you built, but what you were willing to dismantle. Art Callahan, the man who built things, was gone. In his place stood Arthur Callahan, the man who took them apart, and he had a flight to catch. The first-class cabin was an exercise in performative comfort. The leather was too soft, the smiles of the flight attendants too bright. The champagne they offered before we'd even taxied to the runway was aggressively French. It was a world I knew intimately and one I had come to despise. It was all surface, a thin, polished veneer over a core of cheap particle board. I accepted a glass of water and watched Oregon's dense, honest green recede below the clouds. San Francisco greeted me with a slap of cold fog and the frantic energy of a city perpetually chasing its own tail. Kevin had sent a car, not a taxi, not an Uber. A black Escalade with tinted windows and a driver who wore a suit that was $200 too cheap to be convincing. The boy had always loved the props of wealth more than the wealth itself. The drive to his penthouse in Pacific Heights was a tour of his kingdom. We passed the glass and steel temples of the tech giants, monuments to a new kind of gold rush built on algorithms and venture capital. I could feel the hum of the city, the thrum of desperate ambition. It was the same energy as Wall Street, just dressed in hoodies and Allbirds instead of pinstripes. The building itself was a modern marvel of architectural arrogance, a glass spire stabbing at the sky. A doorman in a crisp uniform that probably cost more than my monthly utilities nodded as we entered a lobby that felt more like an art gallery. Marble floors, a soaring ceiling, and a piece of abstract sculpture that looked like a car crash frozen in chrome. It was all designed to intimidate, to make you feel small. It didn't work on me. I've been in rooms where men decided the fate of nations before their second cup of coffee. This was just a more expensive waiting room. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, opening directly into their apartment. The view was the first thing that hit you. A stunning, floor-to-ceiling panorama of the Golden Gate Bridge and the bay, shrouded in a cinematic layer of fog. It was a multi-million-dollar view, and they knew it. It was the centerpiece of the entire performance. Kevin was standing there, framed by the window. He was taller, broader in shoulders, his hair styled with expensive-looking imprecision. He wore a cashmere sweater and jeans that were artfully distressed. He looked like the cover of a magazine for men who inherited their success. "Dad," he said, and the words still sounded like a poorly fitted suit. He opened his arms for a hug. I sidestepped it and offered my hand instead. His grip was soft, manicured. The hand of a man who's never had a callus. "Kevin," I replied, my voice even. Behind him, a woman emerged from the kitchen area. She was tall, sleek, with sharp, intelligent eyes that were taking my measure before she had even spoken. Dressed in tailored black slacks and a silk blouse, she moved with an athlete's economy of motion. This was not the vapid, social climbing type of girl Kevin used to date. This was something far more dangerous. This was a partner. "You must be Arthur," she said, her voice smooth and polished. "I'm Madison. It's so wonderful to finally meet you." She didn't offer to shake my hand. She just watched me, a small, unreadable smile on her lips. "Maddie's my fiancée," Kevin added quickly, putting an arm around her. It was a proprietary gesture, a display of his latest, most valuable acquisition. "My condolences on your aunt's passing," I said to both of them, my eyes on Madison. "Thank you," she replied, her smile never faltering. "Eleanor was a character. We'll miss her." The words were perfect, but her eyes were already on to the next item on the agenda. She was the strategist. I could see it instantly. Kevin was the face of the company, the charismatic frontman. She was the one drawing up the plays. They gave me the grand tour of the Piranha tank, the Italian minimalist furniture, the smart home system that controlled everything from the lights to the blinds with a spoken command, the wine fridge stocked with bottles whose labels I recognized and whose prices I knew were obscene. As they showed off their sterile, magazine-ready world, I was conducting my own audit. I saw the slight tremor in Kevin's hand as he poured himself a whiskey at 3 in the afternoon. I saw the way Madison's eyes darted to a small pile of mail on the marble countertop, which she then casually covered with a copy of Architectural Digest. I noticed that while the apartment was filled with the signifiers of extreme wealth, there was nothing personal. No family photos, no worn books, no object that spoke of a life lived, only of a life curated for an audience. "The guest room is this way," Kevin said, leading me down a hall. "It's got its own bathroom, and the view is almost as good as ours." He opened the door to a room that was as soulless as a luxury hotel suite. It was perfect, and it was empty. I placed my single, old canvas duffel bag on the king-size bed. It looked absurdly out of place. "So," Kevin began, leaning against the doorframe, trying for a casual air, "I know this is all a lot, but once we get the paperwork sorted with the lawyers tomorrow, it'll be smooth sailing. We can get you on a flight back home the day after." He was already trying to manage my exit. Get the ghost back in his coffin as quickly as possible. "There's no rush," I said, turning to face him. I looked him directly in the eye. "It's been 28 years. I like to see what my son has built for himself." A flicker of something, panic, annoyance, crossed his face before being replaced by that salesman's smile. Of course. We're having dinner tonight, at a place Maddie loves, to celebrate Eleanor. And, you being here. I like that," I said. He nodded, relieved again. He was so easy to read. A book written in large print. He thought he was in control. He thought I was a simple old man, a bumpkin from the sticks, dazzled by the bright lights and big city. He and his clever fiancée had a plan, and I was just a pawn they needed to move across the board. They left me to settle in. The silence of the room was absolute, insulated from the city below. I walked to the window. From 30 floors up, the cars looked like toys. The people were invisible. It was a conqueror's view, a predator's view, a view designed to make you forget that the world below was made of real things, real people, real consequences. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out a small, worn block of cedar. I sat on the edge of the ridiculously expensive bed and took a small penknife from my pocket. As the city hummed its frantic, desperate song outside my window, I began to whittle. The blade shaved off fragrant, paper-thin curls of wood. They saw a simple man with a simple tool. They had no idea I was sharpening my scalpel. The cracks in their perfect facade were already showing, and I was just getting started. The restaurant was called Aperture. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign, only an address and a reputation whispered among the city's elite. Inside, it was a cathedral of modern cuisine, all dark wood, muted lighting, and hushed, reverent tones. The patrons were a mix of tech bros in $1,000 sneakers and skeletal women draped in gossamer fabrics. Everyone looked vaguely hungry and intensely important. It was a room suffocating on its own self-regard. Kevin moved through it like a returning king, clapping a man on the shoulder here, waving to a couple there. Madison was at his side, a queen consort, acknowledging the courtiers with a regal nod. I followed a few paces behind, a gray ghost in their gilded wake, my old suit feeling less like armor and more like camouflage. They saw a stooped old man, out of his depth. It was the perfect disguise. We were seated at a prime table overlooking the kitchen, which was encased in glass like a museum exhibit. Chefs in pristine whites moved with the silent, focused intensity of surgeons. A performance for the diners. Everything here was a performance. "Isn't this place incredible?" Kevin said, his eyes sweeping the room, checking to see who was watching us. "Jean-Pierre is a genius, a true artist." "It's very clean," I said, looking at the stark, minimalist decor. Madison gave a small, condescending smile. "He's famous for his deconstructed approach. He takes familiar concepts and breaks them down to their essential components. He charges you $500 to put your own food together," I murmured, just loud enough for them to hear. Kevin's jaw tightened, but Madison laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. "He has a point, darling. But it's about the experience, Arthur, not the food." She was sharp. She'd identified my angle of attack, the simple, no-nonsense craftsman, and was trying to disarm it with patronizing amusement. It was a good move. But this wasn't her first board meeting, and it sure as hell wasn't my first negotiation. A sommelier appeared, a young man, so serious he looked like he was about to defuse a bomb rather than recommend a wine. He and Kevin engaged in a ritualistic dialogue of vintages and regions, a coded language of status. Kevin finally selected a bottle, a burgundy, with a flick of his wrist, a casual gesture that was anything but. The price, I knew, would be roughly equivalent to my workshop's monthly rent. When the wine arrived and was poured, Kevin raised his glass. To Aunt Eleanor, he said, the practiced solemnity in his voice ringing false in the noisy room. She would have hated this place, but she would have loved that we're all here together. Madison and I echoed the toast. I took a sip. The wine was exquisite, but all I could taste was the lie. The dinner was an interrogation disguised as a reunion. They asked me about my life in Oregon. They used words like quaint, simple, and authentic. They were trying to build a box around me, to define me as this harmless, rustic caricature. A man who wouldn't understand the complexities of an $8 million estate. I play my part. I told them about the different types of wood, the challenges of winter storms on the coast, the satisfaction of delivering a finished piece to a happy customer. I gave them the character they wanted. And all the while, I was probing their defenses with my own seemingly innocent questions. So, this startup of yours, Kevin, I said as the waiter placed a dish in front of me that looked like a tiny edible Zen garden. Tell me about it. I read a little online. Synergizing next-generation blockchain architecture for the gig economy. Sound impressive. I'm not sure I understand what any of that means. Kevin launched into his pitch. It was polished, passionate, and full of the empty jargon of his industry. He talked about disruption, scalability, and changing the paradigm. He was selling a vision, a dream. And he was very, very good at it. Our main seed investor is a guy named Alastair Finch, Kevin said, puffing out his chest. Finch Capital. He's a legend in the valley. Believes in us completely. I took a slow bite of a single, lonely scallop. Finch, I said, feigning a hazy memory. That name sounds familiar. Didn't he have some trouble back in '08? With some mortgage-backed securities? I seem to recall a fellow with that name from my old days at Sterling Hewitt. He was a junior analyst then. Ambitious boy. A little too fond of leverage. The effect was instantaneous. Madison's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Kevin's practiced smile vanished, replaced by a deer-in-the-headlights stare. They had assumed my past was a blank slate, a story that ended when I left them. The idea that my history could intersect with their present was a possibility they had never considered. I don't think that's the same guy, Kevin stammered. Alastair is ex-Goldman. Ah, I said, taking another sip of water. Of course. My mistake. So many sharks in that water, it's easy to get them confused. I smiled my simple, harmless smile. The rest of the meal was tense. The easy, condescending rhythm was broken. They were off balance. I was no longer a predictable piece on their board. I was a wild card. Madison tried to recover. So, Arthur, she said, her voice a little too bright. What are your plans after all this is settled? Back to your workshop? I suppose so, I said. A man needs his work. Something to ground him. You know, when my Eleanor would visit me, years ago, she used to say that my workshop was the only honest room in the world. No pretense. The wood is what it is. The tool does what it does. The result is either true or it isn't. There's no way to fake a perfect dovetail joint. I let my eyes rest on Kevin, then on her. You can't talk into being true. You can't disrupt it into fitting. You just have to do the work. Honestly, patiently. Otherwise, the whole thing just falls apart under the slightest pressure. The message landed. I saw it in the tightening around Madison's eyes. The way Kevin suddenly became intensely interested in the dregs of his wine glass. They were living in a house of cards, and they knew it. On the ride back to the penthouse, a heavy silence filled the car. The performance was over. They had brought me to their world to intimidate me, to show me the power and success I had supposedly walked away from. But all they had shown me was their fear. They thought the ghost they'd invited to dinner was there to bless their inheritance. They were beginning to realize he might be there to haunt them instead. And the night was still young. The law office was on the 40th floor of a skyscraper in the financial district, a sterile environment of frosted glass, brushed steel, and hushed efficiency. It was a place designed to extract money with minimal fuss. Kevin and Madison, back in their native habitat, moved with a renewed sense of purpose. They greeted the receptionist by name, exuding an air of ownership. This was their turf. They thought they were back in control. I sat in a ridiculously uncomfortable chair that was clearly chosen for its aesthetic rather than ergonomic qualities, the picture of a patient, slightly bewildered out-of-towner. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies with a bland face and an expensive watch, entered the conference room. He gave me a brief, dismissive nod and focused his attention on Kevin and Madison, the real clients. He was all smooth reassurances and professional sympathy. "Kevin, Madison, my deepest condolences once again," he said, opening a thick leather-bound folder. Eleanor was a unique woman. Her final wishes are, shall we say, as unique as she was. Kevin leaned forward, the picture of feigned grief and eager anticipation. "We're just here to honor her wishes, Robert." Madison placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support that was really a command to let her handle things if necessary. "Of course," Davies said, clearing his throat. "Let's get to it. The will is quite straightforward in most respects. Various small bequests to art foundations, her housekeeper, and so on. But the bulk of the estate, currently valued at $8,212,000, is to be placed in a specifically structured entity, the Eleanor Callahan Trust." He paused, letting the legal term settle. I could see Kevin was getting impatient. He didn't care about the structure, just the payout. "The beneficiaries of said trust," Davies continued, his eyes scanning the document, "are designated as Kevin Callahan and Arthur Callahan." He glanced up at me, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. The dead man at the table. "Now, here is the unique part," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "Eleanor was very specific in the bylaws of the trust. She has structured it not as a simple disbursement, but as a discretionary trust." "Meaning?" Madison asked, her voice sharp. She knew the term. She was just testing him. "Meaning," Davies said, looking directly at her, "that the funds are not automatically transferred to the beneficiaries. Access to the principal and any income generated is at the sole discretion of the appointed trustee." Kevin let out an impatient sigh. "Okay, so who's the trustee? Some bank? Let's get them on the phone and get this over with." Mr. Davies took a slow, deliberate sip of water. He looked down at the document again, then up at the three of us. There was a touch of theatricality in his timing. He was enjoying this. "According to Article 4, Section B of the trust document," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "Eleanor Callahan has appointed a single, sole trustee to administer the trust for the duration of its existence." He looked directly at me. "That trustee is Arthur Callahan." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Kevin stared at Davies, his brain refusing to process the words. Madison's mask of cool composure didn't just crack, it shattered. Her mouth fell open slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. They had walked into this room expecting a coronation, a simple signing of papers that would transfer millions into their precarious accounts. Instead, the keys to the kingdom had just been handed to the village idiot they thought they were manipulating. "What?" Kevin finally choked out, the word a strangled gasp. That's not possible. He can't be the trustee. He's a beneficiary." "It's unorthodox," Davies admitted, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "But it is perfectly legal. Eleanor's instructions are ironclad. The document grants Arthur Callahan, and I quote, absolute and sole authority to disburse funds as he sees fit, based on his personal judgment of whether the beneficiary, namely Kevin Callahan, is living a life of integrity, honesty, and contributing positively to the world." I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. "Eleanor, you magnificent, crazy old artist. This wasn't a will. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. A final, brilliant brushstroke from beyond the grave. She hadn't just left me money, she had left me a weapon, and she had aimed it squarely at the son who had disappointed us both. Furthermore," Davies continued, clearly relishing every word, "the trust stipulates that if, in the trustee's judgment, The beneficiary does not meet these criteria. The trustee is empowered to redirect the entirety of the trust's assets to a list of pre-approved charities, primarily organizations that support traditional arts and craftsmanship. Kevin's face had gone from disbelief to a ghastly, pale fury. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time since I'd arrived. The simple old carpenter was gone. He was seeing the ghost of the father he had betrayed, a man who now held his entire fabricated world in the palm of his hand. "This is insane," he exploded, slamming his hand on the polished table. "It's a joke. She was a crazy old woman. We can contest this." Madison shot him a look that could have frozen fire. "Quiet, Kevin," she hissed, her mind already racing, calculating new angles, new strategies. "Robert," she said, her voice now dangerously calm, "what are the grounds for contesting a trust on the basis of trustee suitability?" Davies leaned back in his chair. "Extremely difficult. You would have to prove malfeasance, gross negligence, or that the trustee is mentally incompetent. Given that the trust creator personally selected him, and he has no criminal record or history of mental illness, a challenge would be a long, expensive, and likely fruitless endeavor." All eyes turned to me. I hadn't said a word. I just sat there, the quiet center of the storm they had unleashed. I looked at my son, his face contorted with rage and desperation. I looked at his fiancée, her sharp mind working furiously to find a way out of the trap. My sister had known. She had known they would come for the money. She had known they would see me as an obstacle, a tool to be used and discarded. So she had turned the tool into the craftsman, the pawn into the king. I finally spoke, my voice calm and reasonable, the voice of a simple man trying to understand. "Well," I said, looking around the opulent conference room, "this is certainly a surprise. I'm just a simple carpenter. I don't know the first thing about managing a trust. I let the lie hang in the air, a piece of bait. I'll probably need a lot of help, a lot of guidance." I looked at Kevin. "I'll have to rely on you, son, to show me you're living the right kind of life, an honest life." The trap wasn't just sprung. It was baited, set, and my son had just walked right into it, dragging his clever partner with him. The balance of power in that sterile 40th floor room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably reversed. And from the look of sheer, unadulterated panic on their faces, they knew it too. The ride back down the elevator was a masterclass in silent fury. Kevin stared straight ahead at the polished steel doors, his jaw muscles working rhythmically. Madison stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the floor indicator, but I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the metallic taste of panic. I remained placid, a tranquil island in their roiling sea of desperation. The moment the penthouse door clicked shut behind us, the facade of civility disintegrated. "A carpenter," Kevin roared, whirling on me. The word was an epithet, a summation of all his contempt. "She left $8 million in the hands of a man who plays with scraps for a living. This is a fucking nightmare." He started pacing, a caged animal in his own gilded cage. "How could she do this? How could you let her?" he demanded, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I haven't seen Eleanor in person in 15 years, Kevin," I said calmly, walking over to the panoramic window and looking out at the fog-draped city. Her choices were her own. "Don't give me that humble bullshit," he spat. "You knew about this. This was a setup." "Kevin, stop it." Madison's voice cut through his tirade like a shard of glass. It was quiet, but laced with steel. "Yelling at him is pointless. He has the power. That is the new reality. We need to think." She turned to me, her eyes cold and analytical. The pretense of warmth, of future daughter-in-law charm, was gone. I was no longer a person to her. I was a problem to be solved, an equation to be balanced. "All right, Arthur," she said, crossing her arms. "Let's be practical. You said you don't know anything about managing a trust. We do. Kevin's company, our finances, they're complex. We can help you. We can guide you in making the right decisions to ensure Kevin meets the criteria." It was a blatant, clumsy attempt to regain control, to frame their self-interest as helpful guidance. "I see," I said, turning from the window to face them. You want to help me judge your own integrity. That seems efficient. My dry tone didn't faze her. We need an initial disbursement, she stated, moving from negotiation to demand. A significant one for the business. An investment opportunity has come up. A time-sensitive one. It's exactly the kind of positive contribution to the world Eleanor's will talks about. How significant? I asked. $2 million, Kevin blurted out, his pacing coming to an abrupt halt. We need it by the end of the week. The desperation was rolling off him in waves. This wasn't for an investment opportunity. This was to plug a hole. A very large, very deep hole in the bottom of their sinking ship. 2 million, I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the air. That's a lot of rocking chairs. I'll have to think about it. I need to understand the business first. Your business. There's no time for that. Kevin insisted. The deal closes Friday. Then you'd better start explaining, I said, walking over to the ludicrously expensive sofa and sitting down. From the beginning. Tell me everything. And so began the second performance of the day. They laid out their vision for Kevin's company, Connix, a platform that supposedly connected freelance workers with tech projects. They threw around all the right buzzwords: AI-driven, synergistic, disruptive. But the more they talked, the more I heard the echoes of 100 other doomed ventures I dissected in my past life. It was all sizzle, no steak. All marketing, no underlying value. They talked for nearly an hour. When they finished, I was silent for a long time. So, you have the coders, the platform, the clients? I finally asked. Of course, Kevin said. We're on the verge of a major breakthrough. Show me, I said. The request through them. Show you what? The platform. Your balance sheets. Your list of investors. Your client contracts. I want to see the books. All of them. Madison's eyes narrowed. That's confidential proprietary information, Arthur. And this is a confidential proprietary trust, Madison. I countered, my voice hardening for the first time. You want $2 million of Eleanor's money? Then you open the books. To me, the trustee. It was a checkmate, and she knew it. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a tense standoff. They stalled, made excuses, claimed they needed to get documents from their office. I waited patiently, the quiet old man on the couch, whittling away at my block of cedar, the soft scrape of the knife the only sound in the room. That night, the real truth began to bleed out from under the door. I was in my soulless guest room, the door slightly ajar. I couldn't sleep. The city's hum was a nervous energy that seeped through the triple-pane glass. Around 2 a.m., I heard their voices from the living room. They thought I was asleep. They weren't yelling anymore. Their words were frantic, terrified whispers. Told you Finch was getting nervous, Madison was saying. His wire was supposed to hit last Tuesday. He's pulling out. He must have heard the rumors. How can we be out of money? Kevin's voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its bravado. We just raised $5 million 6 months ago. On projections, Kevin. Projections, I faked. Madison's whisper was venomous. We used that to pay back the bridge loan from Chun and to cover the lease on this place. The burn rate is $500,000 a month. The platform is a buggy piece of shit. We have 3 real clients, and the other 20 are shell corporations I set up to inflate the user numbers. It's all fake. It's been fake from the beginning. A choke sound from Kevin. The credit cards are maxed out. All of them. I know, she hissed. I've been moving what's left between accounts to cover the interest payments. We're a week away from total collapse. A week. That's why we need your aunt's money. It's not for a deal. It's to stop us from going to prison. Silence. Then Kevin, his voice barely audible. What about him? Your plan was to charm the old man. Your father isn't some backwoods idiot, Kevin. He's playing with us. Show me the books. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows. He's not looking for a reason to give us the money. He's looking for a reason to bury us. I leaned back against the cool wall of my room, closing my eyes. I felt no satisfaction. No, I told you so. Just a profound, weary sadness. My son hadn't just built his life on lies. He had become the lie. There was nothing real left. And Madison, she wasn't his partner. She was his co-conspirator. They weren't in love with each other. They were in love with an idea of a life they could never legitimately earn. Now, Their creation was turning on them, preparing to devour them whole. I stood up and quietly closed my door. I knew everything I needed to know, but knowing wasn't enough. For what I had planned, I needed proof. Hard, undeniable, legally binding proof. I walked over to my duffel bag and pulled out a small, encrypted satellite phone, a relic from my old life, kept for emergencies. I scrolled through the contacts until I found the one I was looking for. A single name, Frank. I stepped into the in-suite bathroom, turned on the fan for white noise, and hit send. It rang twice. Yeah, a gravelly voice answered from 3,000 miles and a lifetime away. Frank, I said. It's the surgeon. There was a pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. Jesus Christ. Arthur, I figured you'd finally learned how to whittle yourself a canoe and paddled off the edge of the earth. Not yet, I said. I need a full workup, a deep dive audit, corporate and personal. A tech startup in San Francisco called Connix. Founder is Kevin Callahan. His fiancée is Madison Vance. I want everything, Frank. Shell corporations, debt structures, investor complaints, bank statements. The works. I need to know where all the bodies are buried. Vance, Frank mused. Madison Vance. Rings a bell. Fired from a white shoe firm in New York a few years back. Something about creative accounting for a client. It was buried, but I'll find it. Good, I said. And Frank. I need it fast. How fast is fast, Arthur? I glanced at the bathroom door at the gilded, hollow world just beyond it. 48 hours, I said. Before they realize they're not in a negotiation. They're in a liquidation. The next 48 hours were a slow, deliberate dance on a razor's edge. I had to maintain my cover as the slightly overwhelmed carpenter while a silent, invisible demolition of their world was taking place 3,000 miles away. I spent the day with Kevin, letting him show me the business. It was a surreal experience. We went to a gleaming co-working space that felt more like an adult daycare for trust fund kids. Beanbag chairs, kombucha on tap, a ping-pong table in the center of the room. He introduced me to his team, a handful of 20-somethings with bright eyes and an unnerving devotion to him. They spoke in the breathless, jargon-filled dialect of the startup cult, and he was their charismatic prophet. They genuinely believed they were changing the world. They had no idea their paychecks were being funded by a Ponzi scheme of lies. Kevin was in full salesman mode, trying to overwhelm me with the performance of success. He showed me charts that always went up and to the right. He drew diagrams on a whiteboard, connecting buzzwords with arrows. He was so desperate for me to believe the lie that I think he was starting to believe it again himself. I played my part. I nodded. I asked simple questions. What does that stand for? How does that help the customer? Where does the money come from? Each question was a gentle probe, forcing him to either invent more elaborate lies or expose the hollow core of his enterprise. He was a surprisingly good tap dancer, but I could see the sweat beading on his brow. Madison, meanwhile, was shadowing me. She'd abandoned the charm offensive and adopted the role of a vigilant handler. She'd appear with coffee, interject with a helpful-sounding clarification, or steer the conversation away from any topic that got too close to actual numbers. She was trying to run interference, to manage the simple old man, and keep him from wandering into the minefield of their finances. The two of them were working in tandem, a desperate, silent ballet, to keep their house of cards from collapsing. I let them show me their Potemkin village. I let them believe they were managing me. It was crucial they didn't suspect that the real audit was happening far away from their control. That evening, they tried a different tactic. The emotional one. We were back at the penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. Madison had discreetly disappeared, leaving me alone with my son for the first time. Dad, Kevin began, his voice taking on a somber, intimate tone. I know things were bad when you left. I was just a kid. I was stupid, and I've regretted it every day. It was a good performance. His eyes were moist. His voice caught at the right moments. He was trying to appeal to a father's love, to a guilt he assumed I must feel. He was looking for a different lever. I just looked at him. Do you know why I left, Kevin? Because of the thing with Davies, he said quickly. And Mom, I know she put a lot of pressure on me. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. That was just a symptom. I left because you made a choice. You weighed honesty against a cheap advantage, and you chose the advantage. I didn't leave you. I left the man you were choosing to become. My only question, all these years, has been whether you ever made a different choice. His face hardened. The appeal to emotion had failed. He saw that the well of fatherly guilt he was trying to tap was bone dry. I built a life, he said defensively. I'm a success. Isn't that what you always wanted? I wanted you to build something real, I said, turning back to the window. This city is full of men who think success is an illusion you sell to other people. I've seen how that story ends. It always ends. The conversation was over. He retreated to his side of the apartment, defeated. The next morning, my satellite phone buzzed silently in my pocket. A single, encrypted text message, package delivered. I excused myself, saying the city air was giving me a headache, and I needed to lie down. In the sterile guest room, I opened my laptop and connected it to a small, anonymizing router I'd brought with me. I navigated to the secure server Frank had set up. The file was named Eleanor's Folly. Frank always had a flair for the dramatic. I opened it. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of forensic accounting and digital espionage. Frank had left no stone unturned. There were the real bank records for Connex, showing a terrifying burn rate and an account balance of less than $50,000. There were the faked financial reports they had sent to their investors, with inflated user numbers and fabricated revenue streams. Frank had even included the original, unaltered server logs next to the forged documents, showing the precise digital fingerprints of Madison's deception. There was a detailed profile on Alastair Finch, their legendary investor. Just as I'd suspected, he was a bottom feeder, a man who'd been disbarred in New York and had reinvented himself in the less regulated world of venture capital. He wasn't pulling out because of rumors. He was being investigated by the SEC for a separate fraud, and his assets were about to be frozen. He was a cornered rat, and Kevin and Madison were just part of his sinking ship. And then there was the file on Madison Vance. Frank had dug deep. He'd found the sealed settlement from her old law firm. She hadn't just engaged in creative accounting. She had actively helped a client create a network of offshore shell corporations to launder money. She'd been fired, but the firm had buried it to avoid a scandal. Frank had found a disgruntled ex-partner willing to talk. He had everything. Finally, there was a list of their personal debts. Mortgages on properties they didn't own, lines of credit from predatory lenders, maxed-out credit cards, a mountain of debt totaling over $3 million, all secured against the fantasy of their company's success. It was all there, a complete, legally actionable blueprint of their fraud. It wasn't just a house of cards. It was a criminal conspiracy. They weren't just facing bankruptcy. They were facing hard prison time. I closed the laptop. The cool weight of the information settled in my gut. I had what I needed. This was no longer about teaching my son a lesson. This was about cauterizing a wound before the infection spread and hurt more innocent people. Their employees, the small-time investors they duped. The surgeon had a diagnosis. Now it was time to operate. I needed a different kind of operating theater. Not a boardroom, not a law office. Something else. I looked out the window at the industrial landscape of the bay, the shipyards and warehouses spread out below the gleaming towers. A place where real things were made and moved. A place with no illusions. I picked up my regular cell phone and made a call to the car service Kevin had been using. I need a car for a personal trip this afternoon, I said. Just a drive. I want to see the old shipyards, down by Pier 70. It was time to choose the location for our final meeting. A place where there would be no beanbag chairs, no panoramic views, no escape. A place that smelled not of expensive cologne, but of rust, salt, and decay. The perfect place to bury a lie once and for all. I gave them the summons an hour beforehand. Meet me, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. 4 o'clock. Building 113, Pier 70. Come alone. The shipyards? Why? Kevin asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Because I want to show you something real, I said, and hung up. The cab dropped me at the edge of the sprawling, derelict industrial park. Pier 70 was a graveyard of American industry, a collection of colossal brick and steel warehouses left to rust in the salt-laced air. It was beautiful in its own way, a monument to a time when men built things that weighed thousands of tons. Building 113 was a cavernous old machine shop, its windows long since shattered, its vast interior open to the elements. I walked inside. The scale of the place was humbling. Light streamed through the broken roof in cathedral-like shafts, illuminating colossal, silent machinery. Lathes, presses, and cranes, titans of a bygone era, now sleeping under a thick blanket of dust and rust. The air smelled of cold iron, damp earth, and the ghosts of a million man-hours. It was the polar opposite of their penthouse. This place had a soul. It had history. It was the perfect stage. I found a spot in the center of the vast space, near a gigantic, silent iron press. I didn't need a table. I didn't need chairs. The setting was the message. They arrived precisely at 4. Their expensive European sedan looked absurdly out of place parked next to the crumbling brick facade. They walked in tentatively, their city shoes crunching on the debris-strewn floor. They looked small and fragile under the soaring, skeletal roof, their fashionable clothes a jarring contrast to the raw, industrial decay. "What is this?" Madison demanded, her arms wrapped around herself as if fending off the cold. Some kind of pathetic metaphor? The noble working man and his decaying factory. "Not a metaphor," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "A classroom. This place made things. Real things. Things that powered a nation. It was built on physics and sweat, not projections and buzzwords. When a weld failed here, people died. The truth had consequences." I looked at Kevin. "You wanted $2 million for an investment." I did my due diligence. From the inside pocket of my old suit, I pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It was a summary, a balance sheet of their lives. "Connix," I began, my voice calm and methodical, the voice of the surgeon presenting his findings. "Current cash on hand, $47,600. Monthly burn rate, $512,000. Known debt, $3.2 million to a list of creditors who are not known for their patience. You are not on the verge of a breakthrough, Kevin. You are approximately 1 week from a catastrophic, bankrupt implosion." Kevin's face went white. Madison's eyes darted around, as if searching for an exit. There was none. "The platform," I continued, "is non-functional on a commercial scale. Your user numbers are inflated by at least 80%, courtesy of a network of shell corporations registered in Delaware and managed by a Ms. Madison Vance. The same Madison Vance who was allowed to quietly resign from the law firm of Adler, Cromwell, and Finch in New York after facilitating a client's money laundering scheme. They buried it, but graves have a way of opening up." Madison took an involuntary step back, her face a mask of horror. "I had her. And your seed investor, Alastair Finch," I said, turning my gaze back to my son, "is currently the subject of a federal investigation. His assets are about to be seized. His last wire transfer to you is not a vote of confidence. It was him trying to hide assets from the government through your company. You're not his golden goose, son. You're his patsy." I let the weight of the words settle in the cold, silent air. The game was over. The lies were stripped bare. There was nothing left but the raw, ugly truth exposed under the dusty shafts of light. Kevin just stared at me, his mouth agape. All the charm, all the bravado, had been sandblasted away, leaving only the terrified 17-year-old boy who had been caught in his father's study. "Ow!" he whispered. "How would you know all this?" "Because this is what I do," I said, my voice dropping, losing its folksy Oregon cadence, and taking on the cold precision of the man I used to be. "It's what I have always done. I take things apart. I find a rot. You and your mother built a story that I was a simple man who couldn't handle the real world. The truth is, I was the man who cleaned up the messes made by people exactly like you." I took a step closer. They both flinched. "You didn't just lie to your investors and employees," I said, my voice a low, cutting whisper. "You committed wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy. You're not looking at failure. You are looking at a 10 to 15-year federal prison sentence. Both of you. Madison finally found her voice, a desperate, broken thing. "What do you want, Arthur?" I looked from her terrified face to my son's shattered one. I had come to San Francisco expecting to teach a lesson about integrity. But the cancer was far worse than I had imagined. A simple lesson wouldn't suffice. This required surgery, radical and painful. "I'm the trustee of Eleanor's estate," I said, my voice resonating with the absolute authority she had given me. "And I am giving you one choice, not a negotiation, a final, non-negotiable ultimatum." I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of their futures hang in the cold, dusty air. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was about balance, about restoring a natural order they had violently disrupted with their lies. "Here is the deal," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the iron press beside us. "There are two paths forward. You will choose one. Today. Now." I held up one finger. "Path A. I do nothing. I walk out of this building, get in a cab, and fly back to Oregon. And tomorrow morning, a complete, meticulously documented file gets anonymously delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California and to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It will contain everything: the forged financials, the shell corporations, Madison's prior indiscretions, Finch's entanglement. Everything. They will descend on you like wolves. You will be arrested. You will lose this apartment, your friends, your reputations. You will be bankrupted by legal fees before you are convicted. And you will go to prison for a very long time. I watched them absorb the brutal finality of it. This wasn't a threat. It was a weather forecast. Inescapable. Or, I continued, holding up a second finger, "There is path B." I paused, letting their desperation build. They were clinging to that second option like drowning sailors to a piece of driftwood. On path B, I use my power as trustee. I take the $8.2 million from Eleanor's trust, and I begin to clean your catastrophic mess. But let me be absolutely clear. Not one single cent of it will ever touch your hands. I looked directly at Kevin. "First, I will make every one of your legitimate investors whole. The small ones, the ones who believed in you, the friends and family you duped. They get their money back, down to the last dollar. Second, I will set up a fund to provide a generous severance for every one of your employees, the young people who trusted you and are about to have their careers derailed by your fraud. Third, I will use the funds to hire a liquidation firm to professionally and legally dissolve your sham of a company, settling all outstanding debts with your vendors." I then turned my gaze to Madison. Her face was a ruin of calculated hope and utter terror. "You, Madison, will get nothing. You will sign a legally binding document drafted by my lawyers, relinquishing any and all claims to Kevin's finances, present or future. You will walk away from this with what you came with. Your lies are your own business from here on out. I am cleaning my son's mess, not yours." She looked like I had slapped her. The idea of being cut out of the solution, of being left with nothing, was an agony I could see playing across her features. Finally, I turned back to Kevin. His face was a blank slate of shock. "After all the debts are paid," I said, "there will be a few million left. That money will go into the primary charity Eleanor designated, the Eleanor Callahan Foundation for American Craft. It will fund apprenticeships and workshops for young people who want to learn how to make real things. Carpenters, glassblowers, stonemasons, weavers. And you, Kevin," I said, my voice dropping lower, "you will be its first recipient. For 1 year, you will give up this life. You will move to Astoria, Oregon. You will live in a small, rented apartment. And you will work, not for a salary, but for a stipend that covers your rent and groceries. You will work in a boat builder's shop, sweeping floors, sanding hulls, and learning how to use your hands to create something of value. You will learn the weight of a hammer. You will learn the patience of a craftsman. You will learn the difference between the story of a thing and the thing itself." It was the heart of the deal, the price, not just financial, but spiritual, an exile and an apprenticeship, a forced return to the principles he had abandoned. At the end of that year, I concluded, you will be free. The company will be a memory. The debts will be gone. You will not have a criminal record. What you do after that is your own choice. but you will have had a chance to learn what it means to build something honest. This is the only path that does not end in a federal prison. I folded the piece of paper and put it back in my pocket. That is the deal. There are no negotiations. There are no counteroffers. You have 5 minutes to decide together. After that, the offer is withdrawn permanently. I turned my back on them and walked 100 feet away to one of the vast, broken windows, looking out at the gray waters of the bay. I gave them the illusion of privacy, but I could hear their frantic, whispered argument. Madison was furious, her voice a venomous hiss. This wasn't her plan. Her plan involved manipulating the money, not being erased by it. Kevin's voice was broken, stripped of all its artifice. He was terrified. I heard Madison say, "Run. We can take what's left and go." And I heard Kevin's reply, weary and defeated. "Where, Maddie? To do what? This? Again? He's right. It always ends. At least this way. At least this way isn't a cage." That was it. That was the flicker of something I had been looking for. The first honest words I'd heard him speak in 28 years. The 5 minutes were up. I turned around and walked back toward them. Madison looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. Kevin just looked broken. "Well?" I asked. Kevin took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at the rust-colored giants around us, at the decaying monuments to real work. He looked at his fiancée, the co-architect of his ruin. Then he looked at me. "We'll take Path B," he said. Chapter 10, Epilogue. Noise and Silence. 6 months later, the Oregon winter had settled in, a season of gray skies, constant drizzle, and the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. My workshop was an island of warmth and light. The rhythmic shhhhshhh of my plane was the only sound, a familiar comfort, the heartbeat of my quiet world. The small bell over the door jingled. I finished my pass with the plane before looking up. Kevin stood there, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. He looked different. The expensive haircut was gone, replaced by something shorter, more practical. The city pallor of his skin had been replaced by a healthy color from working near the windy docks. He was thinner, the softness around his jawline gone, replaced by a harder, leaner look. He wore a simple flannel shirt, worn jeans, and work boots caked in mud and sawdust. But the biggest change was his hands. They were resting at his sides, no longer hidden in his pockets. They were chapped, with a few healing cuts and the beginnings of real calluses. They were the hands of someone who worked. He didn't speak. He just walked over my workbench and placed a small wooden box on it. It was a simple box, made of dark walnut with maple splines in the corners. It wasn't perfect. I could see a tiny gap in one of the joints, a slight unevenness in the finish. But the grain was beautifully matched. The lid was perfectly fitted. It was a solid, honest piece of work. It was real. I picked it up. It felt good in my hands. I ran my thumb over the corner, over the splines. He'd used a technique I favored. When I had been teaching at the local community workshop, he'd been forced to attend 2 nights a week. He'd been in Astoria for half a year. As promised, I had liquidated his life in San Francisco. Madison had vanished the day the papers were signed. The investors and employees were paid. The foundation was established and already funding its first round of apprentices. Kevin lived in a small apartment over a bookstore and worked at the old Gunderson boatyard, a place that smelled of brine and epoxy. We hadn't spoken a single word to each other since that day in the machine shop. I saw him sometimes in town, at the grocery store or the post office. We would just nod, acknowledging each other's existence. Nothing more. Now he stood in my workshop, having broken the silence not with words, but with an object. I opened the box. The inside was sanded smooth, the corners clean. It smelled of walnut and oil. I closed it. The lid made a soft, satisfying thump. I looked at him. His eyes met mine. There was no apology in them, but there was no defiance either. There was just a quiet, weary acknowledgement. He had paid a price. He was still paying it. I nodded. Just once. It was enough. He nodded back, turned, and walked out, the little bell jingling his departure. I didn't know if this year would change him forever. I didn't know if he would stay in Oregon or run back to the world of noise and illusion the moment his sentence was up. The seeds of his mother's philosophy were planted deep. But for the first time, he had built something with his own two hands that couldn't lie. He had created something true. I placed the small box on the shelf above my workbench, next to a worn photograph of a smiling, paint-splattered Eleanor. The future was unwritten. The gap between us was still a chasm. But a bridge had been started. A small, imperfect, but very real bridge. I picked up my plane. There was work to be done. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. From down the hill toward the docks, I could just faintly hear the sound of a power sander starting up. The sound of my son, working late. The sound was mixed with the whisper of my own tool against the wood. Two separate workshops. Two separate men, working in the quiet, making something real in the fading light. It was for the first time in a long time a start.